Hey folks, welcome back. I'm Doug Lynam and I'm your host for the Taming Your Money Monster YouTube channel. And today we are going to explore the shadow structure for each of the 9 Enneagram types and how those create your money monsters. But first, if you like this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. That would be a huge personal favor. And a reminder that my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram. It comes out July 8th, 2025, and pre-orders are available on Amazon. Now, we're going to assume that you probably know your Enneagram type already as we start this video, but if you don't, here's a link to a barcode to the IVQ9 Enneagram test. It is the most scientifically validated and rigorous test available. It's the one I use, the one I recommend to all my clients. You can follow this link to get that information. So what we're going to jump into now, though, is how does your Enneagram type develop, how your shadow develops. And we have to jump into a concept called the childhood wounding. Now, this is grounded in neurobiological science. It's also grounded in childhood developmental psychology. And so we are taking the Enneagram a little bit out of the somewhat woo-woo space it can sometimes be and really trying to give it some some more robust legs so that those of you who are a little bit more analytically minded can get your mind around how all this works. Okay, so what is the childhood wounding and how does it create our Enneagram type, our shadow, and then our money monsters? Well, you have to think of it like this, a bit of a thought experiment. You have to imagine what it was like before you were born, when you're in your mother's womb. What was that experience like? And my hypothesis is, and I think this is validated in much of the developmental research that we have available. It's very hard to test babies in the womb. But nonetheless, when your ego and your consciousness first flickered on, your experience was probably one of unconscious unity with your environment. And this is a very important axiomatic assumption or starting point to the Enneagram. We're assuming that when you first kind of fire up in this world, in the womb, you don't have a clear sense of what's me and what's not me. So you are in a kind of unity with everything you can experience, even though your experience is of course very limited. And you're in unity with it and you're unconscious of it. So you don't know, you don't have that sense of self or ego hasn't developed yet. And then you get born and there's the possibility of neonatal trauma, which we're going to skip over because that's just a whole nother video. But then let's say you get born and bam, you pop out into the world and surprise, you find out there's more to the universe than just this oceanic bliss of oneness that you were floating into for roughly 9 months. And there's things that are not you. And you start to have to interact with these things and develop a sense of self. But when you're born, there's a physical umbilical cord that's being severed between you and your mother, obviously, so then you can be physically separated. But something happens that's very important is we bond with our caregivers at birth very tightly. And we need our caregivers to sort of do the driving for us, for our ego, for the first few years of our lives. So we develop this egoic codependence on our caregivers as a necessity for survival. However, we can't stay that way forever. Eventually, we have to individuate and differentiate from our caregivers, from our siblings, from our parents, and from everything else that we encounter in reality. So we develop that healthy boundary between me and not me. And if you don't have that boundary, a lot of those not me things can get you killed pretty quickly. So it's really an adaptive survival necessity. However, in order to for that differentiation process from your caregivers to happen, just like we cut the physical umbilical cord at birth, for egoic maturation and development, we have to sever that egoic codependent psychological umbilical cord with our caregivers. And so how do we do that? Well, it can only be done with what we call the big 3 negative emotions. And so we know this from the work of the pioneering affective neuroscientist by the name of Jaak Panksepp, that in all mammals, in the mammalian brain, kind of in the mid-limbic region here, there's those three core negative emotions that all the other negative emotions ride on top of are anger, fear, and sadness. And that sadness can also be thought of as separation distress or grief, or sometimes shame is also used in the Enneagram terminology. But we're going to go with sadness for now. And so when one of those three negative emotions hit us a little bit more than the others in our childhood, and that negative emotion, now we get all three, of course, but one of them did more of the cutting of that psychological umbilical cord than others, and that determines where you land sort of in the three triads of the Enneagram, whether you land in the sadness, fear, or anger, sadness, or fear triad. All right, but bear with me here as we explore this concept a little bit more deeply. That psychological cutting of that psychological umbilical cord creates what I call your sacred wound, and that becomes the basis for the rest of your shadow structure, which we're going to develop here shortly. But let's look at how that sacred wound manifests in each of the 9 types. I did a previous video on this, so if this is a rehash for some of you, you can skip through this little portion of it, but I don't want to leave anybody out. So if we look at, we're moving up this bottom half of the double cone of the Enneagram from unconscious unity in the womb, and then we're moving up to conscious separation, or that sense of individuation that we talked about a moment ago. And that's really how you move what I call from thee to me. Thee being whatever you want to call that sacred origin that we all come from, how your soul individuates from, and I would, this is me, I would say your soul is a fractal piece of the divine, but that fractal piece has to separate off, break off, and develop conscious self-awareness. And that's what's happening here through this Enneagram shadow structure development. Okay, so you get this sacred wound, you get hit with anger, sadness, or fear a bit more than the others, but there's 3 ways to process that emotion. We can either internalize it, which is kind of like giving yourself an emotional wedgie, or you can externalize it, and that's like having a bit of a food fight with the world, or you can have both. And then there's 3 ways to process the 3 different big 3 negative emotions, and that's what creates the 9 different Enneagram types. But each type, again, it's a spectrum on an arc of a circle, and so there's room for infinite variety here inside each of the 9 types. It isn't just a fixed point, which sometimes confuses people, but really, you might also think of your Enneagram type as almost like a hex code. A hex code is the 3 colors, red, green, blue, and then the combination of that anger, that sadness, that fear, however those 3 colors sort of mix together determine where you're going to sort of fall on this Enneagram color wheel. All right, so let's go around the 9 types very quickly. We've got the sacred wound of anger, if that's what cut your psychological umbilical cord, and you externalize that, you would become a type 8. We call them the challenger. I call them the Hummer of ego consciousness because they're sort of like the Enneagram's battering ram against reality. And they have externalized that fear, and it creates their greatest fear, which is being harmed or controlled. So they're always pushing against reality. They're always like striving for a certain kind of intensity. They love a good fight. They love a good argument. And they're always trying to essentially control their environment before it controls them. All right, we'll jump over to the 1 for a moment because they internalize that anger. They direct it at themselves rather than at the world like the 8 does. And what that does is it creates their greatest fear of being bad, defective, or somehow corrupt. So this really strong internal critic that is always sort of just gets triggered whenever they do something wrong or they see other people doing things wrong. So they tend to be very principled. They live by a high moral standard. We call them the improver. I call them the BMW of egos because they're precision engineered, but they require a fair bit of maintenance. So the ones are always trying to fix themselves and or fix others or the big systems and big problems in the world. So that's one of their great superpowers and strengths. And then if you're in the middle, we've got the type 9. They have an internalized and externalized anger. So that creates for them a fear of loss of wholeness should their anger ever get triggered. They're sitting on basically a volcano of anger, and they never want to have to run into that. So we call them the peacemaker. They're very conflict avoidant. They don't like conflict. They like to keep things harmonious and peaceful as possible. I call them the RV of egos because they kind of tend to like to camp out and rest and be comfortable, while oftentimes, sometimes the world can pass them by because they don't want to get into the fight and trigger their anger, and that can create some issues for them. All right. Now we move to the sadness triad, which is often called the shame triad, but the neuroscience tells us that sadness is more primary of emotion than shame. And you might think of it like sadness about your perception of or sadness or grief around how you perceive yourself or how you think others perceive you, which is a pretty good definition for shame. So you can use them interchangeably here, but technically it would be more accurate to call it sadness. All right, if you have an externalized sadness, that you become a type 2, meaning you are sad or feel that shame and grief about how you think others perceive you, and that creates your greatest fear of being unlovable. So 2s become the helper, or I call them the ambulance of egos. They're always running around, being of service, being of use, which is a good thing, but they tend to have a hard time taking care of themselves. They're looking. Another way of putting it is they're playing a game of give to get. They're helping others in the hope that you will actually take care of them and validate them and tell them how wonderful they are and how lovable they are. And that's kind of somewhat true of all of the sadness triad. They're in different ways. Each of them is looking for validation and connection, and And then if you were, of course, in the anger triad, you're looking for control and empowerment in different ways. And if you're in the fear triad, you're looking for security and safety. And again, in each of your different ways that manifests for your type. Now I'll jump to the 4. So 4 is the individualist. I call them the custom car. They have this deep internalized sadness about how they perceive themselves. And so they feel like they don't have an identity. They don't know who they are. They're sort of always looking to stand apart and pull back from conventionality and do things differently. So Steve Jobs was a classic 4. The tagline for Apple was "Think Different." And that's a pretty good tagline for 4s in general. And 4s, of course, hate the Enneagram at first more than any other type because they hate being put into what they think is a box. But sadly for 4s, there's a box for people who hate to be put into a box. So that's the type 4. And they're always trying to stand out and be different. And then if we go to type 3, they have that internalized and externalized sadness, creates their greatest fear of which is being worthless, that they don't have any sense of value because they feel ashamed or embarrassed, again, how they think people perceive them and how they perceive themselves. As a type 3, that's me. All the types, there's no good or bad types in the Enneagram showroom, but of course, type 3 is then going to be the race car or the achiever. They're always looking to stand out, basically saying, look at me, look how great my YouTube channel is, and hopefully it is, or look at all the accomplishments I've achieved. So that way, those achievements are trying to assuage their sense of worthlessness. And you can tell a 3 because they're very good at being chameleons. 3s are sort of the mask changers of their personas. They will blend in and fit in, change their persona in a heartbeat to sort of fit in with whatever crowd they're in front of to try to impress them and win approval. And then we'll move over to the fear triad. We've got type 5, which is going to internalize fear, and that creates their greatest fear of being incompetent, that they don't have the internal resources to navigate reality effectively. So they withdraw, they pull back. We call them the investigator. I call them the compact car of egos because they're quiet, they're efficient, and they can fit into tight mental spaces where others fear to tread. And so the 5 is kind of the ultimate introvert on the Enneagram, of the Enneagram types. They tend to be very withdrawn, and they don't tend to let a lot out, and they tend to live in their heads a lot. They're trying to master all of reality in their mind before they act, and so they tend to be, again, very reserved with their opinions, with their ideas, because they're afraid if they let out too much, it's going to drain them, and they're also called a compact car because their gas tank for social interactions is pretty limited. They need a lot of quiet and alone time to recharge. And then if we move to type 7, the enthusiast, I call them the SUV. They're the kind of go anywhere, do anything ego vehicle of the Enneagram. But their externalized fear means they're afraid that the external world isn't going to meet their needs, their physical needs, their emotional needs, their intellectual. So they're going to go out and get what they want. And they're going to they're basically, they struggle with gluttony and they struggle with more. Like the way you can tell a 7 is they run on FOMO, which is fear of missing out. They're always looking for the next adventure. What comes next? Because that will, in the hope that that next thing will keep their pain or privation at bay. And since pain and privation occur in the present moment, that's the place the 7 never really wants to rest in, because they might have to deal with themselves. So they're always kind of distracting themselves. They tend to be, you'll find more ADHD and those types of things in a 7 more than the other types, although that's not specific to a 7. And then lastly, we come back to type 6, which has an internalized and externalized fear. They're afraid that they don't have the inner skills to navigate reality like the 5, but they're also afraid that the external world isn't going to be there to meet their needs either. So they be called the skeptic. They're sort of not sure which way to go or what to do a lot. So they run on a lot of fear. And I call them the family sedan of egos, because they want every safety feature possible, and a few others that they have invented themselves. But 6s are like the ultimate worst case scenario thinkers. They tend to catastrophize pretty easily, but they're always very well prepared for an emergency because they saw it coming. And crises don't really bother them because they were expecting it all along. So they're very good in a crisis. And they're very loyal, because decision making for a 6 can be very hard, because they've got this committee of voices in their head, always kind of giving them different opinions. They're not sure which way to go. And so when they do commit to a person, a place, an idea, an ideology, they're very loyal to that and tend to stick with their guns with those things. Okay, so that's the different ego types and how they develop through the childhood wounding. And what it says is that there are 2 basic ways we can have an unhealthy relationship to money. One is to be anxiously attached to it, where we're a little too greedy, a little too obsessed with money. It becomes the thing that drives much of what we do. Or we can be avoidant of it. We can push it away and not want to deal with it and procrastinate on dealing with it. And that creates a whole different set of problems. And we can be anxious or avoidant in different areas of our lives. So we've got the 4 pillars of finance. We've got earning, saving, investing, and giving. So earning, saving, investing, and giving are the 4 pillars of finance that you have to master to become a money master. And a lot of us are actually what I call the jumbled style. We alternate between money anxiety and money avoidance in different areas. So you could be an anxious earner, but if you're an overspender, that means you're an avoidant saver. I mean, you're not putting away money that you could then invest. And some people are great earners, savers, and investors, but they're terrible at giving. They never really manage to use their money in service to others, which is the ultimate goal of having real power and wealth, is to do some good in the world with it. And some people need to work on that skill. So if you're an 8 and you are money avoidant, you would be the detonator. That means you tend to detonate prudent financial limitations like budgets or boundaries. You're going to grab the check at a restaurant just to show everyone who's the boss. You're going to want to maybe drive a nicer car than you can afford just because you want to look important and powerful. But then you're going to be maybe take risks a little too easily, be a little too cavalier with your finances, because you don't want those things, that budget, to get in the way of living your life and doing the things you want to do, which can cause you to rack up debt, cause all kinds of credit card issues, so on and so forth. But then on the flip side, if you're money anxious, then you would be the dominator. And the dominator would be, what was that movie Succession? If you ever saw that, the lead character in there is a good example of a dominating 8, somebody who can't stop acquiring more and more and using it to really control and manipulate the people around them, which can be very toxic. Then if we'll go to the type 9, we've got the spud and the dud. The spud is the couch potato, because 9s hate conflict. The spud is the person who doesn't want to deal with the conflicts that money creates in their lives. They don't want to have the fight with their spouse. They don't want to have to fight with the credit card companies. They don't want to have to fight with their budget. And so over time, they tend to just let those things go, and then their financial situation deteriorates. And then we've got the dud. And the dud is the 9 who runs around in a flurry of activity, but that activity never seems to really translate into meaningful action because, again, that fear of conflict gets in the way of them having the fight that they need to have with themselves and others in order to really overcome their money issues. And then for 1, we've got the pious and the prude. So if you are a prude, meaning you're money avoidant, that is the type who demonizes money rather than being bad at dealing with money. So ones have this compulsive need to be good. And if they aren't good at dealing with money, they do this sort of moral tap dance and they make dealing with money bad. And so not dealing with money becomes the perfect way to deal with something that is inherently corrupting, bad, evil, whatever. So if you follow that twist of logic, you get someone who's prudish about finances and doesn't want to deal with it and kind of looks down at their nose at those who do and judges people who might be wealthier than them with a certain kind of moral snobbery, if you will. They kind of put their wallet in a chastity belt and treat money like it's the devil's pocket lint. And then we've got the pious, which is someone who's maybe annoyingly too good at dealing with money. The pious one is the anxious type, and they're going to be super anal retentive about dealing with their finances. I had a business manager at an office I worked at once, and he made me fill out the same form 3 different times for a $7.50 reimbursement because the staple wasn't in exactly the right place. It's like he's got to be really just that, got to do it my way, got to do it the right way, or we're not doing it at all. And then we move to type 2. We've got the bleeder and the bonder. The bleeder is the money avoidant type. So the bleeder is someone who is always giving of their time, their talent, their treasure in order to be of service of others, but not in a healthy way. It's a needy way. It's a codependent way where I use the analogy. There's there's that parable that it's better to give a person. It's better to teach someone how to fish than to give them a fish every day. And the bleeder too is the type who would rather give someone a fish every day with a side of tartar sauce and you're an amazing note in order to keep the flow of gratitude coming. They're addicted to the gratitude and the dopamine hit they get from feeling needed and loved that their generosity creates, but then that can decimate their personal financial life because they're bleeding out everything all the time. They never get to the saving and the investing. They're jumping right to the giving, essentially, and that can be very financially detrimental. And then we get to the bonder is the type 2. Again, they want that gratitude, but if they're financially secure and they're very money anxious and they're grasping of money and they have a lot, they can then dole it out in a very manipulative way to bond people to them to create a financial codependence. They never want to let people out of that orbit and let them stand on their own 2 feet because that would interrupt the flow of gratitude that the 2 gets. All right, then we move to the type 3. We've got the achiever, and we've got the barrier and the blinger. The barrier is the type 3. Since 3s have this fear of being worthless, they tend to equate their net worth and their self-worth. Those 2 things tend to correlate very tightly. And being poor is never a good image, and type 3s are very image conscious. And so when their finances aren't in good shape, they don't want to look at all the sadness or all the shame that it brings up in them. So they bury their heads in the sand and they look away and they race in the wrong direction. And that was me for many, many years. And not fun. But anyway, and I got over it, and you can too. And I'm going to teach you the steps and how to do that in the later videos. But for now, we need to get the mechanics of the Enneagram under our belts. So we've got the barrier 3, doesn't want to deal with it, and then we've got the blinger 3. So a blinger is a money anxious 3 who is very grasping of money, but they tend to bling out their life rather than saving and investing and giving prudently. They're going to tend to spend too much of what they have on status symbols. They're going to always have the nice watch, the fancy car, the big house, even if their financial situation doesn't warrant them having that much sort of bling. Their financial life tends to be like a Hollywood set. It's all, it looks great from the outside, but it tends to be paint and plywood behind the scenes. And then we've got the type 4. Now, 4s, when they're money avoidant, I call them the flop because their financial situation tends to be a complete, flop. You can hear them face planting on the pavement when they talk about their finances. And 4s, because they have this need to be different, they tend to chafe at the conventionality of the prudent things that one would do to earn, save, invest, and build up a strong and robust financial life. They reject these things. They are kind of out of hand. They may turn their nose up at the capitalistic system. Not that there aren't reasons to be mad at capitalism, and externalities are a problem, and not glossing over the problems that capitalism can create, but it's still the best of bad systems. Trust me, the alternatives are far worse. So you need to be able to play the capitalistic game to some extent to build real wealth, and 4s just reject the game entirely. And so they tend to flop in their financial life. They don't tend to have the discipline that comes to like building a budget and tracking their spending. Anyway, so that's the flop. And then we've got the flinger, which is the money anxious 4. And they're the ones who are always grabbing more money, but what they want to do with it is, rather than using it to build a better world or be of service to others, they tend to fling it at forms of self-expression to stand out and stand apart. So I say that they epitomize the idea that you can't take it with you, but you can sure wear it out the door. So you'll often see fours standing apart and different in how they dress or how they decorate their home. Everything's sort of vintage or boutique or very, bougie, whatever it is. But they can fling endless amounts of resources and money at anything that makes them feel special. And so that can be a real trap for the 4. Now move to the 5, the investigator. When they are money avoidant, we call them the moot, meaning money is moot means irrelevant. They just don't care about it. They think that anything to deal with things dealing with the material world are somewhat irrelevant. They're busy living in their heads and spinning their ideas and building up their grand theories, but then they're neglecting their financial life. And then we have the miser, which is the opposite of the moot. And the miser is someone who's very, very greedy and very clingy around money. They're going to track every penny. And so 5s struggle with stinginess. So stinginess can be their emotions, their feelings, their ideas, but also their money. And so when a 5 gets really stingy, they become the miser. And then we're going to go to the type 6, the skeptic. When they are money avoidant, they become paralyzed. They just don't know what to do. So they're kind of trapped like a deer in the headlights. Pretty self-explanatory. Or on the money anxious side, they become the puppet or the pugilist. Now, pugilist means boxer or fighter. It's an antiquated term, but I needed it for alliteration. So it's kind of a weird dual nature, kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing that happens in 6s, where they'll be kind of like, when they're anxious about money, they'll be puppets on a string. They'll sort of kind of the opposite of the 4. The 4 rejects conventionality. The 6 is going to kind of embrace conventionality, and like they want to feel protected. They want systems to be embedded in that will make them feel safe and secure. So they're going to kind of follow the crowd and do what's expected of them. And that can actually lead to a pretty solid financial life, even if it's a bit uninspiring. But if something triggers that or gets in the way of their goals or their objectives, or there's a dent in their budget or something that really sets their financial life off track, then they become fierce fighters. They kind of lash out in anger and fear at anything that might threaten their safety, which is how they view money. Is money becomes that tool to make them feel safe in the world. And if they don't have it or they're not getting what they want or expect, then they're going to see that kind of moving into that sort of fight mode for the 6. And then for type 7, we've got the enthusiast, we've got the grabber and the gorger. The gorger being the money avoidant 7, And what that means for a 7 is they're going to basically, as soon as any resources come in, they get their paycheck, they're just going to spend it. They're going to gorge themselves on experiences. They're going to gorge themselves on luxury, whatever makes them feel good and satisfies their desires. But they're a bit like the prodigal son. That story, that parable story from the Bible, where they waste all of their resources and inheritances on basically bacchanalian revelry. And that, of course, does not end well for anybody. And then we've got the grabber 7, which the money anxious 7 is the type that is going to be, they want to, if they're the SUV of egos, they want a cargo carrier, they want to be towing a trailer, and they want to be loading that stuff with all the toys and all the money. They can't get enough resources to hoard, in part because they're afraid of pain and privation, and they think that if they get enough resources, that's going to stave off their existential fear of being in pain. And, money does some of that, but it won't protect you from all the slings and arrows of life, of course. All right, that's the money monsters. And again, this is going to be a bit of a long video. I should have warned you at the start. But now much of that was a bit of overview. Now we're going to really get deep into the shadow work of each of the 9 types. And I want to show you the shadow structure. This is sort of a bit of a technical piece. You have to bear with me, and then it will make more sense when we put it into action. We'll walk through the specific shadow structure for each of the 9 types, which I think is where you'll find the most benefit and how that really leads into your money monster. All right, so here's the shadow structure. Remember, we're starting off in the womb in this sort of state of unconscious unity, and then our ego grows. The shadow causes our ego to grow and inflate, And again, it's necessary. And this is really the first, we call this the first half of life. And it's our path to independence from that egoic codependence that we are starting with before we can sever that psychological umbilical cord with our caregivers. And now we're going to start from the bottom up. So we already covered the sacred wound. And then the sacred wound leads into the greatest fear, which we also just covered in that past clip. And then there's a worst vice. And your worst vice is the thing that keeps your greatest fear at bay. It's a negative trait, but it's designed to keep you driving as far away and as fast away from your greatest fear as humanly possible. But your worst vice, and I've put the traditional names for these terms in parentheses. So traditionally, that's called your passion. I've changed the terminology for the Enneagram significantly in my book, Taming Your Money Monster, because for a number of reasons, but mostly to clean up the linear logic and to allow the shadow structure that we're creating here to mirror the enlightenment structure, or your path to wholeness, which we'll cover in the next video. So in order to get all those ideas to line up cleanly, I had to do a little bit of some wordsmithing. So apologies if that confuses some of you who are already familiar with the Enneagram, but hopefully you can still follow along. All right, so you got your worst vice, but the worst vice is kind of it's a kind of a negative thing, and your ego doesn't really want to look at that. And so what happens is we develop what we call I call your primary ego addiction. And this is the thing that hides your worst vice, your greatest fear, and your sacred wound from your conscious mind. You're probably not even aware of these things driving most of your behaviors in life, because your ego has done a really, really good job of hiding it from yourself. And your primary ego addiction, it makes your worst vice feel good. It's sort of like it gives you a dopamine hit whenever you engage in your primary ego addiction, but it's maladaptive. And then the problem with your primary ego addiction, just like any ego addiction, is you can overdose on it. And when you overdose on it, and that creates a whole lot of stress. And what you'll find if you study the Enneagram deeply is most of the stress in your life is self-created. It's created by these ego addictions that we have. And they're responsible for most of the suffering you're going to experience in your adult life, aside from random tragedies, which no one can predict, and those happen to all of us. But aside from those things, this is really what's going to create most of the suffering in your personal life, in your professional life, and that's why it's so important. And of course, your financial life, which is why they're so important to tackle. But when we've overdosed that primary ego addiction, we have a secondary ego addiction that we flip to. And your secondary ego addiction creates the inverse response of your primary ego addiction. So as a metaphor, it's a bit like chasing a stimulant with a depressant, or vice versa. I keep bumping my microphone here. So if you've overdosed on a stimulant, then one way you can kind of combat that is by taking a depressant. And that's sort of what your secondary ego addiction is doing. It creates what I call your ego stress response. And that ego stress response is, again, it's the actual behavior that you manifest, which will be the inverse of your primary ego addiction. And that, of course, leads all into the money monsters. All right, that was just a quick overview of how that process works. But let me walk you now through the shadow structure of each of the 9 types so you can see it in action. All right, let's start with a type 1. So we're starting at the bottom of this graph. We're looking at the sacred wound of internalized anger. And then you can see we talked about how that leads to your greatest fear of being bad or defective. And that creates your worst vice, or what's called traditionally your passion, which is anger. Now that anger is different from your sacred wound, even though they both have the word anger in them. And that worst vice is the anger that happens when you don't feel like you're doing things quite right, or the people around you aren't doing things quite right. And you don't want to feel anger, because anger is a bad emotion. You kind of know that anger is a bad emotion. And so you're trying to do everything you can to not tripwire over it, and why you're trying to be so hyper-perfectionist in everything you do. But of course, that's not possible. And so when there's the primary ego addiction, therefore, for the 1 is then resentment. They get resentful and frustrated and just annoyed at themselves or others when things aren't going according to plan. But that resentment can build up to toxic levels. And when it does, they flip to their secondary ego addiction, which is melancholy. And so melancholy creates this, so it instead of being mad at everyone else, it makes them really sad and kind of withdrawn and pull into themselves. And that creates their ego stress response, which is the combination of their greatest vice, which is still anger, and that secondary ego addiction of melancholy, creates the sorrow which blocks resentment. Now, it's very technical. You have to sit with this a little bit to figure out how that works for yourself, but I trust you'll be able to decipher that. And then now that gets us to the money monsters, the pious or the prude for the type 1. Again, so we'll cover the enlightenment structure soon, and we're really in the bottom half of the double cone Enneagram, which I've developed. And now let's look at the type 2. You've got that externalized sadness, that sadness about how you think other people perceive you, and that creates the greatest fear of being unlovable. And then the greatest vice for a type 2 is pride, meaning they take pride in what a good, noble, selfless, self-sacrificing person they are, because look how helpful they are, look how much they give to others. They want to feel important, and they want to feel like they're needed, that they're loved, that they're valued. And so they have a certain kind of unwarranted pride in what a good person they are. But that's a bad thing to feel. So what they do is they develop a primary ego addiction to flattery. And what that means is they're kind of easy to spot because they're going to be the most kind, sweet, helpful, endearing people you can meet. And they're very charming. But you have to remember that their help has strings attached to it. It's conditional help. They want you to give something back to them, which is flattery, essentially. They're giving what they want to get. They're going to tell you how wonderful you are with the expectation that you're going to turn around and tell them how wonderful they are, which is really the end game of all of their helpfulness. But when that flattery doesn't work, or they give beyond what they're stretched too thin, they've bitten off more they can chew, or essentially they aren't getting the gratitude and praise back that they expected, then they flip to their secondary ego addiction, which is vengeance. Meaning they're going to take revenge on the person who doesn't appreciate them. And that can be very subtle. The vengeance then creates, their ego stress response, which is revenge. And that means it's sort of like pride plus vengeance equals revenge, right? So it's like hell hath no fury like a wounded pride, essentially. And so that revenge can be subtle. It can mean they're going to pick a fight. It means they could fall ill and develop psychosomatic illnesses because forcing you to take care of them, which is what they wanted, which is what they were hoping for to begin with. They didn't get it directly, so now they're going to play this other kind of game. Or they could just send you on a guilt trip, do things to make you feel bad about yourself because you don't appreciate them enough. Lots of different ways. They could stab you in the back if they're really mean, or they could gossip behind your back. Those are just little digs, ways to get back at you for not appreciating them. And then, of course, that leads into the bleeder and the bonder, the money monsters, and how those then manifest in different ways when we layer anxiety or avoidance on top of that shadow structure. And now we'll come to type 3, my favorite type. That's me. So none of us get out of this game without getting our egos bruised, if we're going to be honest about ourselves. So the type 3 has that internalized and externalized sadness, which makes their greatest fear of being worthless fire up. And then the greatest vice for a 3 is then deceit. And that doesn't mean we're necessarily liars or that we are honest in some factual way. But what it means is that we're chronic people pleasers. We are going to walk into a room and we are going to change our persona or our masks that we wear and how we present ourselves in order to try to win approval from whomever we're around, to assuage that sense of worthlessness. And that's the origination of the deceit. It's like, I'm going to show you the best possible side of me, or the sides of me that I want you to see that I think are going to impress you, rather than being authentic and honest about really who we are and where we are in life. And so that deceit then, in order to hide that, to cover that up, we adopt a primary ego addiction to vanity, meaning, look at me, look how wonderful I am, look how impressive I am, and always trying to put ourselves out there in a very positive way.
And so when we engage in sort of good marketing as a 3, then that feels good, that our vanity feels justified, but it's really riding on this greatest vice of deceit. The problem, of course, is that vanity, when you push it too far, will create the very problems that it was trying to avoid. Meaning, if you're too vain and you're too selfish and too self-centered, then what happens is it makes you look like an idiot in front of other people, and things fall apart, and then triggers your fear of being worthless. And so when that happens, we flip to our secondary ego addiction, which would be evasion, meaning we're going to hide from ourselves and hide from reality, and that creates our ego stress response, which is then illusion, meaning we're going to elude our problems or elude looking at the things that we've done wrong because it triggers our shame, it triggers our sense of worthlessness. And so if the normal default mode for a 3 is look at me, look at me, look at me, then when they're in their stress response, it's don't look at me. I don't even want to look at me. I want to hide in front of Netflix and a pint of ice cream for a week until, my problems, the stress level diminishes and I have a little more courage to get back on the hamster wheel. Okay, then that leads into the money monsters, which the barrier and the blinger, which are riding on top of this whole shadow structure for the type 3. Moving to type 4, we have internalized sadness or shame about how they perceive themselves. That creates their fear of having no identity and no significance in the world. They're able to see the beauty and the wonder in people. They see what's special about everyone around them. They just don't see what's special about them. And so what that does is it creates their greatest vice, which is envy. They envy the uniqueness they see in other people. They envy the status, or they envy what other people have that they feel is lacking in themselves. And so in order to hide all that envy and all that fear from their conscious mind, that rests now in the unconscious, in the shadow, and they develop a primary ego addiction to melancholy. And what that means is it's sort of a bittersweet sadness that 4s revel in, because it allows them to feel uniquely misunderstood, like their suffering is somehow much more intense and worse than the rest of us, which ironically is often true because type 4s tend to be very sensitive and they feel things much more deeply than the rest of us. So in a way, it's true that they are suffering more in some emotional way than most people, but they also kind of enjoy that suffering because that's what allows them to stand apart and feel special and different from everybody else. So it's an ego game that they're trapped in. And when that melancholy doesn't work, when they've overdosed on it, they flip to their secondary ego addiction, which is flattery, like the type 2. And what that means is and it's a way of, the flattery sort of pulls them out of their shell. It keeps them from collapsing in on themselves. And they sort of look for other people to rescue, or mostly someone to rescue them. And that flattery, that desire to reach out and connect with other people in often an unhealthy way, but it's better than not connecting at all. So, that's why it's there. It creates that if you have the envy of others, plus your flattering of them, creates your ego stress response for a 4, which is then codependence. So it's easy for a 4 to get trapped in a codependent relationship because it's what helps pull them out of their melancholy. At least they're connecting with somebody, and there's some authentic meaning, and basically what they're looking for is for someone to see them in their pain and acknowledge them and say, I see you and I see how special you are. I see how much pain you're in. I see all the struggles you're going through, and you're wonderful and you're amazing and all those things. Okay, and then that leads us into the money monsters, the flop and the flinger, the anxious and the avoidant that we talked about earlier. Again, that's all riding on top of this unconscious programming in the shadow. Jumping over to type 5. All right, 5, we've got the internalized fear for a 5, which then creates their greatest fear of being helpless or incompetent. And what that means is they then adopt a greatest vice of avarice. And that means they're always trying to get more. They're sort of like a black hole. They pull things in, but don't let a lot out. Meaning they're pulling in ideas, they're pulling in resources, they're not letting out a lot of their feelings, a lot of their emotions, a lot of their talent, time, or treasure to others because they feel that doing so sort of depletes them. They get depleted very easily from social interactions, and so they tend to be they withdraw into themselves. But that avarice isn't a good thing to experience, so they develop a primary ego addiction to stinginess, meaning that's the stinginess with their emotions and their ideas and their opinions and their money and their time. And so they tend to be very withholding as one of their problems. But when that stinginess gets them in trouble, when they're too isolated or they're too trapped in their own mind, that stinginess tends to create the very pain that they're running away from. It's creating that sense of being helpless and incompetent because they're so trapped in their brain, or they're too trapped inside themselves. So they flip to their secondary ego addiction, which is planning, which is of course looking like a type 7, and meaning that planning plus avarice creates indulgence, which is going to block their stinginess, meaning they're going to indulge in some of their darker fantasies. They're going to maybe indulge in their addictions, or they're going to splurge in some way to kind of release the stress that all that stinginess and all that avarice is creating for them. It gives them a little bit of an out, even if it's in an unhealthy way. And that leads into the moot and the miser money monsters for the type 5. Okay, we're getting near the end here. We got 6 and then one more triad to go. So we've got the type 6. We've got that internalized and externalized fear, and they fear not having protection or guidance. They're looking for security in the world, and that creates their greatest fear of cowardice, meaning they don't trust themselves and they don't really trust others. So they're very in this fearful place, and then that cowardice, of course, is not a good thing to experience in yourself, and our ego doesn't want to consciously acknowledge it, so we bury that in the unconscious, and we have for the 6 a primary ego addiction to fear, which is this sort of worst case scenario thinking that's happening all the time that feels justified because they can always find a reason to be scared because there's lots to be scared of in the world, but they tend to overdo it, and that creates this chronic anxiety for the 6. But when that anxiety overwhelms them and they get completely swamped by it, they switch from that primary ego addiction to a secondary ego addiction to vanity. I mean, they start to look a little bit more like a type 3. And so when you have vanity combined with cowardice, it creates self-importance. So that's the ego stress response for a 6, is like, look how important I am. They're going to be running around with their to-do list, taking charge, or trying to make themselves or giving their opinions in ways that may not be entirely helpful for others, and really kind of making themselves essential in a way in order to control their environment and try to assuage some of their fear. And then that leads into the paralyzed or the puppet and pugilist for the money monsters for the 6. And then moving into type 7, we've got that externalized fear, and that creates, as we talked about, being in pain or privation as their greatest fear. And their greatest vice for a 7 is then gluttony, meaning, again, they're gluttons for experiences, for opportunities, for just whatever comes next. It's like, oh boy, I'm so excited about the future because they don't want to be trapped in pain in the present moment. And so they're always planning for what's coming next. And they don't like to limit their options. They hate that. But when that overwhelms them, when too much planning, too many experiences, they get stretched too thin, things don't go, they don't get what they want. They're planning for all this stuff, but if it doesn't happen, then rather than doing more planning, they're going to fall back, because that would just burn them out. They'll fall back into resentment, looking a bit like a type 1. And so they're resentful and frustrated and angry at themselves because they've been overindulgent, or they're not meeting their goals, or people aren't, things aren't going the way they planned, and they're going to get really frustrated, resentful, and angry. I should be more excuse me. I should be more precise. That resentment combines with gluttony to create frustration, and frustration is their ego stress response. Sorry for not making that clear. And then we ride on top of that the grabber and the gorger and the grabber for the 7. Okay, moving on to type 8 with their externalized anger, the challenger. They hate being harmed or controlled, and their greatest vice then is lust. Meaning, it isn't just about sex. It's a passion for intensity. They love intense things. They love challenges. They love risks. But again, that you don't want to see that too clearly, so they develop a primary ego addiction to vengeance. And what that means, it isn't that they're petty in their revenge or things like that. It's that the vengeance means pushing. When you push against them, they're going to push back harder. If you try to control them, they're going to try to push back and control harder from you. They don't want to feel like they aren't the boss, that they don't have agency. They want empowerment and they want control. And if you're getting in the way of that, that's what the vengeance is, that sort of that eights tend to approach life with. But when you push against reality tends to push back. And sometimes that pushback is more than even an 8 can handle, or they don't feel like they know they just feel overwhelmed by their circumstances. Their desire for intensity is causing too many problems, and more intensity is just going to make things worse. So they fall back to their secondary ego addiction, which would be stinginess, looking a bit more like a type 5. And that stinginess combines with lust, which is their greatest vice, to create rigid withdrawal. And so if you think of them as an up-armored Humvee, always they're sort of the battering ram of the Enneagram, then the 8 kind of retreats into their armor. They get even more armored and more defensive and retreat into this rigid withdrawal until things calm down and they can get back on the road doing their usual shtick. Okay, and then that becomes the detonator or the dominator when they're money anxious or money avoidant. And wrapping it all up with a type 9, we've got that internalized and externalized anger, which is like there's a volcano sitting underneath their consciousness that they never want to trigger, because it's like the Incredible Hulk could come roaring out and rip them and the people around them apart. And that would be what we call a fear of loss of wholeness or fragmentation as a result of all this anger pouring forth. And then the 9 then has their greatest vice, which is then sloth, meaning they don't like conflict. They don't want to deal with asserting themselves or their needs too much, because that could create conflict. So they tend to have this sort of slothful approach to life, which is very easygoing, very live and let live, and things around them can be very peaceful and very calm, but not a lot tends to get done. And so the sloth is the worst vice for a 9. But to hide all that from their ego, from their conscious mind, and bury it in their unconscious mind, they then develop a primary ego addiction to evasion, meaning they're evading problems, they're evading conflict, because they don't like all the negative emotions that brings up. But when they overdo it and they've evaded too much and the problems around them are getting pretty dire, then they're going to switch to a secondary ego addiction of fear, and they'll start looking more like a type 6. And what that means is that fear is going to combine with sloth. So your greatest fear never goes away. You never change your Enneagram type. You might look like a different type temporarily, if you're in your secondary ego addiction, but you're still always your type. That's a key point that I think gets confused with many people in the Enneagram. And so their sloth plus fear, their secondary ego addiction, creates security seeking, which is their ego stress response. In other words, what security seeking means is they might get someone else to kind of jump in and solve their problems for them, or they might sort of retreat into kind of a defensive posture and become very passive aggressive and combative in a certain way, and stubborn and rigid in their position, because they want the security that the fear is creating this need for security. The world is in chaos, so they're going to have this security seeking behavior, which can be all kinds of different ways depending on how the circumstances and your type. And of course there's instinctual variance, which we'll get into later. All right, and then to wrap it up, we have the money monsters for type 9, the Spud and the Dud that we covered earlier. That's then riding on top of this whole shadow structure for the type 9. So hopefully now at the end of this video, you have a sense of how your type develops, how your shadow structure develops, and how that then feeds into your money monsters. Again, if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll also put up the code for the Enneagram test again if you would like that. And I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll talk to you again very soon. Take care.